My family thought it would be amusing to hand over my entire wedding fund to my twin sister right in front of me at a crowded restaurant. My mother smirked over her champagne glass and told me that my sister was an investment while I was just a corporate drone. My sister just laughed. I did not scream or throw a drink. I simply paid for my own meal and walked out into the Chicago night. 12 hours later, my phone was practically melting with 67 missed calls. My mother was sobbing, leaving voicemails begging me to fix what I had done. My sister texted me that I was destroying her life. I took a sip of my morning coffee and sent one final reply. It is too late. The paperwork is already signed. I am Gemma, 35 years old, and a senior forensic accountant used to uncovering hidden assets and financial fraud. But the greatest fraud I ever witnessed was the illusion of my own family. Before I take you back to that dinner, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut ties with toxic relatives who took your loyalty for granted. Growing up in a wealthy Chicago suburb, I learned early on that appearances meant everything to my parents, Diane and Richard. They lived for the country club memberships, the luxury leased cars, and the curated image of upper-middle-class perfection. But behind closed doors, the reality was entirely different, especially when it came to how they treated me compared to my twin sister Sienna. The evening that ended, my family began at Prime and Cut, an overly expensive downtown Chicago steakhouse. The kind of place where the waiters wear white gloves and the lighting is kept intentionally dim to make the gold accents on the walls glow. The air smelled of dry aged beef, truffle butter, and the heavy perfume my mother always wore. Nolan, my fiancé, was sitting beside me, his warm hand resting over mine under the thick linen tablecloth. We had been invited to dinner under the pretense of celebrating our recent engagement. Nolan and I had just finalized our venue for a modest but beautiful ceremony, and I thought for once my parents were actually going to show an interest in my life. I should have known better. Instead, the entire evening had completely revolved around Sienna and her fiancé Trey. Sienna was an aspiring social media influencer whose career consisted mostly of posting pictures of clothes she bought with our parents' credit cards. Trey was a fast-talking tech entrepreneur who always had a pitch for a new app or crypto venture that required other people to fund it. They were loud and demanding, treating the waitstaff poorly and dominating the conversation. Trey spent the first course bragging about his projected valuations and networking events, while Nolan, a highly successful corporate attorney, quietly ate his steak and listened with polite restraint. When the dessert plates were cleared, my mother Diane suddenly stood up, holding her glass of champagne. She tapped the side of it with her silver fork until a few heads from neighboring tables turned our way. My father Richard sat back in his leather chair, beaming with pride. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Diane cleared her throat and smiled radiantly at Sienna and Trey. She announced to the table that she and Richard were so incredibly proud of the power couple Sienna and Trey were becoming. She said that a couple with such massive potential needed a wedding that reflected their brand. She talked about how a destination wedding in Italy would be the perfect networking opportunity for Trey and his investors. Then my father reached under his chair and pulled out a rolled-up piece of thick poster board. He unrolled it and handed it to my mother. It was an oversized novelty check, the kind people use for charity golf tournaments or lottery winnings. My mother handed it across the table to Sienna and Trey. Sienna squealed in delight, and Trey let out a loud whoop, clapping his hands together. I stared at the giant check. Written in bold black marker across the center was the amount of $75,000. But it was not the amount that made the blood freeze in my veins. Because of my profession, my brain automatically catalogs financial details. I looked at the bottom of the novelty check where my father had gone to the trouble of printing the actual routing and account numbers to make it look official. I recognized those numbers instantly. It was the specific family trust account that my parents had set up years ago. That account held exactly $50,000. It was the money my grandfather had originally left behind, specifically designated as my wedding fund. My parents had controlled the trust, and promised me for the last 6 months that the funds would be transferred to my account to pay for the venue Nolan and I had just booked. The extra $25,000 on the check meant they had completely emptied out their own savings just to inflate the gift for Sienna. They were giving away my inheritance, my promised wedding fund to fund a lavish Italian vacation for my sister and her unemployed boyfriend right in front of my face. Nolan shifted in his seat. He knew exactly what that account number meant because we had just reviewed our wedding budget the night before. His jaw tightened, but he waited for my cue. He always let me handle my family in my own way. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. My corporate training had taught me how to completely detach my emotions from a confrontation. I looked directly at my mother and kept my voice perfectly level. I asked her very simply why the routing number on that check belonged to the trust account holding my wedding fund. The table went completely silent. Sienna stopped squealing and clutched the giant piece of cardboard to her chest, as if I was going to leap across the table and snatch it from her. Trey scoffed and rolled his eyes, taking a large sip of his wine. My father looked away, pretending to be highly interested in the dessert menu. My mother did not look guilty. She did not even look embarrassed. Instead, a cold, condescending smirk spread across her face. She looked down her nose at me and adjusted her diamond necklace. She stated with absolute calm that Sienna and Trey were building a lifestyle brand and needed the financial backing to secure their image. She told me that Nolan made a good salary and that we did not need a fancy wedding. She actually looked me in the eyes and said that a simple courthouse wedding suited my boring corporate lifestyle much better anyway. I sat there listening to the woman who raised me tell me that my milestones did not matter. Every childhood memory of being pushed aside so Sienna could shine flashed through my mind. The time my parents skipped my college graduation because Sienna had a minor audition for a commercial. The time they asked me to co-sign a car loan for Sienna because her credit was ruined and called me selfish when I refused. It all culminated in this singular moment in a steakhouse surrounded by strangers. I looked at Trey, who was grinning smugly. He leaned forward and told me that I should not be a hater just because I did not understand how venture capital and investments worked. He said I was stuck in a traditional mindset and needed to learn how to support family who were actually going places. Sienna laughed. A sharp, mocking laugh that echoed off the mahogany walls of the restaurant. Nolan moved to stand up, his protective instincts flaring, but I placed my hand gently on his knee to stop him. I did not need a savior. I just needed an exit. I realized in that moment that trying to win the love and respect of people who were fundamentally committed to misunderstanding me was a complete waste of my energy. I reached into my designer purse and pulled out my black American Express card. I motioned for the waiter who had been awkwardly hovering near the service station. When he approached, I handed him the card. I instructed him to charge exactly $240 to my account, which covered my steak Nolan salmon and our 2 drinks. I told him to put the remaining $1,200 on a separate bill and hand it to the gentleman holding the giant check. My father's face instantly dropped. He stammered, asking what I was doing. He said it was a celebration dinner and that I usually covered the bill when we went out to nice places. I stood up and smoothed out my skirt. I looked down at them with the exact same coldness my mother had just shown me. I told them that since they had $75,000 to invest in a brand, they could certainly afford their own dinner. I turned around and walked out of the restaurant with Nolan right beside me. I did not look back. I did not care about the scene I was causing. I left them sitting there at the table, staring at a massive bill they had zero intention of paying. But as I walked out into the cool evening air, I felt a profound sense of calm wash over me. Because they had no idea that their cruel little stunt with the trust fund was nothing compared to the financial secret I had been keeping for the last 3 years. They thought they had just taken my wedding fund. They did not know I owned their entire lives. The morning sun was just starting to filter through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my condo when my phone began vibrating against the nightstand. It buzzed with the frantic, relentless rhythm of people who were used to getting their way. I lay there for a moment, breathing in the quiet. Nolan was already in the kitchen, and the smell of fresh coffee drifted down the hallway. It was a perfectly peaceful Saturday morning until I picked up my phone and unlocked the screen. The family group chat was an absolute war zone. There were dozens of messages, mostly from my father, Richard. He had typed out massive blocks of text detailing exactly how humiliated they were after I walked out of the steakhouse. According to his dramatic retelling, the restaurant manager had threatened to call the police when my parents realized their own credit cards were completely maxed out. They actually had to call one of my father's golf buddies to drive down to the restaurant late at night to cover the bill. Instead of being embarrassed by his own financial recklessness, my father placed the entire blame squarely on my shoulders. He demanded a formal written apology for abandoning my family and insisted I wire them the $1,200 immediately to compensate for the emotional distress I had caused my mother. I swiped away the group chat notifications, feeling nothing but profound exhaustion. Then a direct message popped up from Trey. I expected him to be furious, but Trey was a hustler who only saw people as stepping stones. His message was a masterclass in manipulation. He told me that my behavior at the restaurant was incredibly toxic and that I was projecting my own insecurities onto Sienna because she was glowing with bridal energy. But then came the pivot. He said he was willing to forgive my negative attitude if I did him a quick favor. He was trying to secure a premium office space for his new tech startup in a downtown high-rise, a building that my firm happened to audit. He told me to pull some strings and get him a heavily discounted corporate lease to make up for ruining his celebration dinner. I did not reply to any of them. I got out of bed, put on my running shoes, and went for a long jog along the lakefront. By Monday morning, I was back in my element. Walking into the sleek glass and steel lobby of my corporate restructuring firm, I felt the familiar rush of control. Here I was not the disappointing daughter or the boring sister. I was a senior forensic accountant. People twice my age deferred to my judgment when millions of dollars were on the line. I took the elevator to the 40th floor, walked into my corner office, and locked the door behind me. I sat down at my mahogany desk and booted up my computer. I bypassed my standard work emails and opened a highly secured encrypted drive hidden deep within my network. I typed in a complex passcode and opened a digital folder labeled Richard and Diane Promissory Note. I leaned back in my leather chair and stared at the scanned legal documents glowing on the monitor. It was a secret I had kept perfectly hidden for 36 months. 3 years ago, my parents' obsession with maintaining their wealthy image finally caught up with them. They had taken out multiple secondary mortgages to fund my sister's lifestyle and pay for their luxury car leases. When my father's business took a minor hit, the entire house of cards collapsed. The bank was days away from foreclosing on the sprawling suburban home they loved more than anything. They were terrified of the public humiliation of being evicted in front of their country club friends. So they begged a private equity firm to buy their debt and restructure it to save them from bankruptcy. What they did not know was that the private equity firm did not care about them. The bank was ready to throw them onto the street. I was the one who saved them. I quietly formed a blind limited liability company called Apex Financial. I used my own corporate bonuses and professional connections to purchase their defaulted mortgage. For the past 2 years, they believed some faceless, generous investment group was cutting them slack on their missed payments. In reality, I was the one quietly covering their shortfalls out of my own pocket, so they would not lose the roof over their heads. I literally owned their house. I stared at the signature line where my father had arrogantly signed his name to my holding company. They had just stolen my $50,000 wedding fund to pay for Sienna's Italian vacation, all while I was secretly paying the property taxes on the very house they slept in. They called me a boring drone while actively surviving on my charity. I closed the folder and let out a slow, steady breath. The time for charity was officially over. I picked up my desk phone and dialed the extension for my firm's internal legal department. I asked to speak with our lead real estate attorney and told him to begin processing the defaulted payments. The grace period was entirely finished. When I returned to my condo that evening, I found Nolan sitting on the sofa reading a brief. Before I could even tell him about my meeting with the legal team, the doorbell rang. It was not a polite chime. It was a rapid, aggressive knocking. Nolan frowned and went to open the door. Diane and Sienna pushed right past him, stepping into our living room as if they owned the place. Sienna was holding a thick manila folder, and my mother looked furious. I crossed my arms and asked them what they were doing in my home uninvited. My mother did not even say hello. She immediately demanded that Nolan and I cancel our reservations for the exclusive honeymoon suite we had booked in Hawaii. She said that since Sienna and Trey were having a high-profile destination wedding, they needed a world-class honeymoon to match their aesthetic. She told me to transfer the booking to Sienna's name and frame it as our wedding gift to them. I actually laughed out loud. I looked at my sister who was standing there in a designer coat, paid for by my stolen trust fund, and told her absolutely not. I told them that Nolan and I had paid for that suite with our own hard-earned money, and they were not getting a single thing from me ever again. My mother lost her temper completely. Her carefully crafted country club facade dropped, and she screamed that I was a selfish, miserable spinster who would never understand true family loyalty. In her blind rage, she aggressively swept her arm through the air, knocking over a beautiful hand-painted ceramic vase Nolan had bought for me on our first anniversary. It shattered into dozens of pieces across the hardwood floor. She did not even flinch or apologize. She simply stepped over the broken clay and sneered at me. Before marching toward the door, Sienna slammed the thick manila folder she was carrying onto my kitchen island. She arrogantly ordered me to look it over. She said it was Trey's business prospectus for his new startup. My mother turned back one last time and ordered me to approve the project for a corporate grant from my firm. She threatened to completely disown me and bar me from the wedding if I did not support my twin sister. Then they walked out, slamming my front door behind them. Nolan calmly grabbed a broom from the closet and started sweeping up the shattered vase. He did not yell or act surprised. He just looked at me and asked if it was time. I nodded. I walked over to the kitchen island and opened the manila folder Sienna had left behind. As a forensic accountant, I spot financial inconsistencies for a living. It took me less than 5 minutes of scanning Trey's prospectus to realize he had committed massive financial fraud. To secure his upcoming venture capital funding, Trey had heavily falsified his assets to make his company look highly profitable. He had listed a piece of high-value real estate as his primary collateral to guarantee a massive business loan. I stared at the address printed on his fraudulent documents. He had claimed ownership of my parents' suburban house, the same house that legally belonged to my limited liability company. The trap had perfectly set itself. I stared at the address printed on his fraudulent documents. He had claimed ownership of my parents' suburban house, the same house that legally belonged to my limited liability company. The trap had perfectly set itself. I picked up my phone and reopened the private text message Trey had sent me the day before, the one where he had called me a toxic sister and demanded I use my corporate connections to secure him a discounted lease at a premium downtown office building. He had framed it as a necessary apology for ruining his celebration dinner. Now I saw exactly why he was so desperate for that specific building. The venture capital firm he was aggressively courting had their regional headquarters on the top floor. He wanted to secure a lease in the same building so he could look like a major industry player operating in their premium airspace. He wanted to use my professional reputation to legitimize his absolute scam of a business. I did not reply to his text right away. I let him sweat in his own arrogance. Instead, I spent the rest of the evening cross-referencing his glossy business prospectus with public property records and federal corporate filings. As a forensic accountant, I dismantle complex financial webs for a living, and Trey's web was incredibly sloppy. It was worse than I originally thought. Not only had he listed my property as his primary financial collateral, but he had forged a preliminary deed of trust using a fake notary stamp to make it look official. This was no longer just a bitter family dispute over a stolen wedding fund. This was highly documented wire fraud and a blatant federal crime. The next morning, I walked into my office building with a singular cold purpose. I bypassed my usual morning coffee stop and went straight to the legal department on the 42nd floor. I sat down with David, our lead compliance attorney, and handed him the manila folder. I did not give him any emotional family backstory. I simply asked him to review the listed collateral against our internal property database. I watched his eyes widen as he read through the forged documents and realized the implications. I calmly explained that the property listed as collateral belonged to Apex Financial, which was my private holding company. I then told him that the venture capital firm Trey was attempting to defraud was actually one of our top-tier clients. My firm takes a zero-tolerance approach to fraud, especially when it involves protecting the assets of our own corporate clients. Within an hour, the massive gears of corporate justice began to turn. My compliance officer drafted an immediate high-priority alert to the venture capital firm flagging Trey's entire portfolio and his startup as a critical financial risk. We forwarded the forged deed of trust directly to their legal department. We also submitted a formal fraud report to the state banking regulators and the federal authorities. But I was not finished. I returned to my corner office and pulled up the encrypted file containing my parents' defaulted mortgage. For 2 years, I had quietly covered their missed payments out of my own pocket to save them from the humiliation of eviction. I opened my banking portal and officially canceled the automated monthly transfer. Then I drafted an official cease and desist order to myself, formally terminating the extended grace period on their loan. I instructed my legal team to begin the immediate foreclosure process on my parents' estate. The bank would be sending the neon-colored eviction notices directly to their mahogany front door by the end of the week. While I was systematically dismantling his entire future from my desk, Trey was growing incredibly impatient. Since I had not responded to his text message demanding the office lease, he decided to escalate his intimidation tactics. He knew Nolan worked at a prestigious law firm downtown and decided to ambush my fiancé during his lunch break. Nolan later told me exactly how the bizarre encounter played out. He had been sitting at a corner table in a quiet, upscale coffee shop, reviewing a dense merger contract, when Trey confidently slid into the chair opposite him. Trey did not even bother to order a drink. He just leaned across the small table, projecting the unearned arrogance of a man playing with Monopoly money. Trey told Nolan that he needed to get his future wife in line. He claimed that my refusal to secure his office lease was petty, jealous, and completely unprofessional. He actually had the audacity to mock Nolan's salary, telling him that corporate attorneys were just glorified paper pushers who would never understand the kind of massive generational wealth he and Sienna were about to build. He told Nolan that if he did not convince me to approve the corporate grant and the commercial lease by Friday, they would officially ban us both from the family and revoke our invitation to the wedding. Nolan did not get angry. He did not raise his voice or bother to defend his highly successful career. Nolan has always possessed a quiet, steady confidence that absolutely terrifies deeply insecure men like Trey. Nolan simply closed his laptop and took a slow sip of his black coffee. He looked Trey dead in the eyes with a perfectly pleasant smile. Nolan told him that he should probably save every single dollar he had right now. He casually suggested that Trey was going to need a very expensive defense attorney in the near future and mentioned that his own firm charged $1,000 an hour. He then stood up, paid for his coffee, and walked out, leaving Trey sitting alone at the table. Trey scoffed, calling Nolan a jealous loser before storming out of the coffee shop. He thought Nolan was just making a pathetic, empty threat to defend my honor. He had absolutely no idea that Nolan had already reviewed the extensive fraud alert my firm submitted that exact same morning. When I got home from the office that evening, I felt a strange, profound sense of peace. The heavy anxiety that had plagued me my entire life regarding my family and their constant demands was completely gone. I walked into the kitchen and saw a thick envelope resting on the granite counter. It was made of heavy, expensive cardstock and stamped with a custom gold wax seal featuring Sienna's initials. I broke the seal and pulled out the invitation. It was for Sienna's official engagement gala to be held at the most exclusive private country club in the city. The invitation boasted about a champagne fountain, a 5-course catered dinner, and a live jazz band. It was designed to look like a royal decree rather than a simple party invitation. I looked at the bottom where it politely requested an RSVP by the end of the week. I stood there in my quiet kitchen holding the heavy cardstock, knowing exactly how this extravagant party was being funded. Every single drop of champagne poured and every single note played by that jazz band was being paid for by my stolen wedding fund. They were throwing a massive lavish party to celebrate a fraudulent tech bro and a selfish influencer, using the exact money that my grandfather had legally promised to me. They desperately wanted an audience to witness their fake success and applaud their stolen wealth. I decided it was only fair to give them exactly what they wanted. I took a black fountain pen from the drawer and checked the box confirming my attendance. On the blank line designated for a +1, I wrote down a single word: attorney. I sealed the envelope and left it by the front door to be mailed in the morning. The trap was fully operational and locked into place. Now all I had to do was wait for them to throw the party of the year so I could burn it all to the ground. The evening of the engagement gala arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather my parents always claimed was a sign of their inherent good luck. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my bedroom adjusting the clasp of a diamond tennis bracelet Nolan had bought me for my 30th birthday. I was wearing a sleek tailored emerald green evening gown that cost more than my mother's entire country club wardrobe. I did not dress to blend in. I dressed like a woman who was about to foreclose on her family. Nolan walked up behind me in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit and kissed my cheek. He did not ask if I was ready. He already knew. We drove to the Oak Ridge Country Club in comfortable silence. As we pulled up to the valet stand, the sheer scale of my parents' financial irresponsibility was on full display. The entrance was flanked by massive towering ice sculptures carved into the shapes of swans. A string quartet was playing in the grand foyer, and waitstaff in crisp white tuxedos were circulating with silver trays of vintage champagne. Every single extravagant detail, from the imported orchids cascading down the grand staircase to the custom gold lighting, had been paid for by my stolen wedding fund. When Nolan and I walked into the main ballroom, the ambient chatter noticeably dipped. My mother Diane was standing near a massive champagne fountain, wearing a heavily sequined silver gown. She spotted me, and her fake socialite smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered. She leaned over and whispered something to my father, Richard, who immediately scowled in our direction. They had clearly assumed that my RSVP was a bluff. They thought I would be too intimidated and too heartbroken to show my face at a party funded by my own stolen inheritance. They were completely wrong. My mother glided over to us, projecting her voice so the nearby wealthy guests could hear her performative motherly warmth. She loudly thanked me for coming and said it was so brave of me to show up despite my recent financial struggles. I just smiled at her with a cold, detached amusement. I thanked her for the warm welcome and complimented the ice sculptures, noting how incredibly expensive they must have been. Her eyes narrowed, but before she could snap back, a photographer pulled her away for a group picture. Nolan and I checked the gold-trimmed seating chart displayed on an easel near the doors. It was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive family politics. Sienna and Trey were seated at a massive elevated head table covered in white roses alongside my parents and Trey's family. The rest of our wealthy relatives and Trey's venture capital friends occupied the premium tables ringing the dance floor. Nolan and I had been assigned to table 14. It was the furthest possible table from the stage, pushed directly against the swinging wooden doors of the catering kitchen. Every time a waiter rushed in or out, the doors would violently swing open, hitting the back of my chair. As we sat down, my Aunt Patricia drifted over holding a martini. She looked at me with deep, exaggerated pity. She sighed and said that my mother had told everyone about my little tantrum at the steakhouse. Patricia patted my shoulder condescendingly and told me that it was perfectly natural to feel jealous of Sienna's success, but that I needed to stop acting out and making a fool of myself in public. She suggested I take notes from Trey on how to properly build wealth so I would not have to split restaurant bills anymore. I did not defend myself. I just took a sip of my sparkling water and told Patricia to pay very close attention to the speeches later. Dinner was a lavish 5-course affair featuring lobster bisque and dry-aged beef Wellington. I ate quietly, watching the room. I watched my father buy rounds of expensive scotch for his golfing buddies, playing the role of the generous patriarch. I watched Sienna pose for dozens of photos, flashing her massive diamond ring for her social media followers. I watched Trey work the room, shaking hands with men in expensive suits, loudly pitching his tech startup as the next billion-dollar unicorn. It was a beautifully orchestrated theater of absolute delusion. When the dessert plates were cleared, the heavy crystal chandeliers dimmed, and a single spotlight hit the main stage. The room grew quiet as my father took the microphone. He gave a long, boastful speech about how proud he was to fund this incredible night for his beautiful daughter and his brilliant future son-in-law. He talked about legacy and building a dynasty. I just swirled the ice in my glass and waited. Then it was Sienna's turn. She practically floated up to the microphone, wiping a fake tear from her perfectly contoured face. She thanked our parents for their endless generosity and their unwavering belief in her brand. But Sienna could never just take a victory gracefully. She had to twist the knife. She looked directly across the dark room toward table 14. She smiled sweetly into the microphone and said that true wealth is about family and love. She said that some people only care about spreadsheets and hoarding pennies, living small, boring lives because they are too afraid to take risks. She actually looked at the crowd and joked that she was just glad I finally dressed up and left my cubicle for the night, even if I could not afford to chip in for the champagne. A ripple of polite, restrained laughter echoed through the ballroom. My parents beamed with pride. Aunt Patricia shook her head in amusement. Nolan tightened his grip on my hand beneath the table. Finally, Trey took the stage. He adjusted his designer jacket and leaned into the microphone with the practiced arrogance of a man who firmly believed he was the smartest person in any room. He thanked Sienna for being his muse. Then he launched into a full corporate pitch for his startup. He bragged that he had just secured a massive multi-million-dollar valuation from a top-tier venture capital firm. He claimed his proprietary software was going to disrupt the entire industry and make everyone in his inner circle filthy rich. He then shaded his eyes from the spotlight and pointed toward my table. The entire room turned to look at me. Trey laughed into the microphone and said that since he and Sienna were about to be the new power couple of the city, he wanted to extend an olive branch. He condescendingly offered me a job doing his basic bookkeeping once his company went public, so I could finally experience what real success looked like. The room erupted into genuine laughter. 150 guests laughing at the boring, frugal spinster sister who was sitting by the kitchen doors. My mother looked at me with absolute triumph. She thought she had won. She thought she had successfully crushed my spirit in front of everyone who mattered in her superficial world. I did not cry. I did not look away. I simply pushed my chair back and stood up. The laughter slowly died down as I stepped away from the table. People expected me to run out of the ballroom in tears just like I had done when I was a teenager. But I did not walk toward the exit. I walked straight toward the stage. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor. The silence in the room became heavy and suffocating. I reached into my emerald green designer purse, the one my mother always insisted was a cheap imitation, and pulled out a thick stack of legally binding documents stapled together. I walked up the 3 carpeted steps onto the stage. Trey looked confused, stepping back as I approached him. I did not ask for the microphone. I simply reached out and took it from his hand. I turned to face the crowd, looking directly at my parents, who were suddenly sitting perfectly rigid in their chairs. I tapped the top of the microphone twice. It echoed loudly through the silent ballroom. The trap was finally springing shut. The weekend after the restaurant incident was supposed to be my sanctuary. My condo is located on the 32nd floor of a high-security building overlooking the Chicago River. I paid for every single square foot of it with money I earned through 60-hour work weeks and relentless dedication to my career. It is my safe haven away from the suffocating expectations of my family. I spent that Saturday morning reviewing quarterly tax strategies while Nolan made us breakfast. We were listening to soft jazz, the aroma of fresh espresso, filling the open-concept living space. It was the exact kind of peaceful, boring life my mother had mocked, and I loved every second of it. But peace is not something my family allows me to have. Just before noon, the intercom on my wall buzzed. I pressed the audio button, expecting the doorman to announce a package delivery. Instead, the sharp, impatient voice of my mother crackled through the speaker. She demanded that I buzz them up immediately, claiming it was an absolute emergency. I looked at Nolan, who had just set down a plate of eggs. He raised an eyebrow but nodded. I pressed the release button, unlocking the secure elevator. 3 minutes later, heavy, aggressive knocking echoed through my hallway. I opened the door to find my mother Diane and my twin sister Sienna standing on my welcome mat. They did not look like people dealing with an emergency. They looked like people preparing for a hostile corporate takeover. Sienna was holding a thick manila folder and a designer handbag, while my mother wore a tailored coat and an expression of pure entitlement. They did not wait for an invitation. My mother pushed past me, marching directly into my living room, with Sienna right behind her. They kept their shoes on, tracking city dirt onto my pristine hardwood floors. My mother immediately began surveying my home with her usual critical eye. She ran her fingers over the back of my custom Italian leather sofa and sighed heavily. She muttered that my taste was far too cold and modern. She said it felt like a sterile corporate lobby and lacked the warmth of the traditional suburban home she and my father had built. The deep irony of her criticizing my home while living in a house I secretly owned was not lost on me. I crossed my arms and stood in the center of the room, refusing to offer them a seat or a drink. I asked them directly what the emergency was. Sienna dropped her designer bag onto my kitchen island and let out a dramatic, exaggerated sigh. She complained that wedding planning was absolutely destroying her mental health. She claimed that Trey was under immense pressure with his tech startup, and they were both desperate for a world-class honeymoon to decompress after their destination wedding in Italy. I stared at her blankly, waiting for the point. My mother took over, stepping forward with a completely fake and overly sweet smile. She told me that she and Richard had been reviewing Sienna's bridal registry and realized that a massive piece of the puzzle was missing. They had the Amalfi Coast venue secured, but they had not booked a honeymoon. My mother then looked at me and casually mentioned that she knew Nolan and I had secured the ultra-exclusive penthouse honeymoon suite at a luxury resort in Maui. She was talking about the reservation Nolan and I had made over a year ago. It was a highly sought-after suite that overlooked the ocean and had a private infinity pool. We had paid for it entirely in cash as our special treat to ourselves for our modest courthouse wedding. My mother did not ask me for a favor. She gave me an order. She told me to call the resort immediately and transfer the entire reservation into Sienna's name. She said it would be the perfect wedding gift from a loving sister to make up for my embarrassing little stunt at the steakhouse. She actually instructed me to absorb the cost of the transfer fees, so Sienna and Trey would not be burdened with any unexpected expenses. Sienna chimed in, nodding enthusiastically. She explained that Maui was the perfect backdrop for her influencer brand. She told me she already had several luxury swimsuit sponsors lined up and needed that specific penthouse suite because the lighting on the private balcony was legendary for photos. She told me that I did not need a suite like that anyway because I never posted on social media and nobody cared what I did on my vacation. She suggested that Nolan and I could just rebook a standard garden view room at a cheaper hotel down the street, and we would not even notice the difference because we were so low maintenance. The sheer audacity of their demand hung in the air like thick smoke. They had just stolen my $50,000 wedding fund the night before. They had publicly humiliated me and called me a corporate drone. And now, less than 24 hours later, they were standing in my living room, demanding that I hand over my own prepaid honeymoon so my sister could take pictures in a free swimsuit. Nolan stepped out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. He stood next to me, a silent wall of support. He did not say a word because he knew this was my battle to fight. I looked at my mother and then at my sister. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the calm, measured tone I use when informing a client they are being audited. I told them absolutely not. I said that the reservation was in my name, paid with my money, and it was staying exactly where it was. I told Sienna that if she wanted a luxury penthouse in Hawaii, she and her wealthy tech entrepreneur fiancé could pay for it themselves. The fake smile instantly vanished from my mother's face. The carefully constructed facade of the caring matriarch shattered completely, revealing the raw, unfiltered disdain she had always held for me. Her face flushed dark red with anger. She took a step closer to me, pointing a manicured finger directly at my chest. She dropped her voice into a vicious, venomous hiss. She told me that I was the most selfish, miserable person she had ever known. She said that from the moment I was born, I had been difficult, stubborn, and completely unwilling to sacrifice for the greater good of the family. She claimed that my father and she had bent over backwards to tolerate my cold personality and my absolute lack of grace. She looked around my beautiful, expensive condo and sneered. She said that all my corporate money could not buy me a personality or a heart. She told me that I was deeply jealous of Sienna, because Sienna was vibrant, beautiful, and loved by everyone, while I was just a bitter spinster playing accountant. She actually said that the only reason Nolan was even marrying me was because I was a safe, boring bet who would never challenge him. The cruelty in her words was designed to break me down. It was the same tactic she had used my entire life to force me into compliance. Whenever I set a boundary, she would attack my character until I apologized just to make the emotional abuse stop. But standing there at 35 years old, financially independent, and completely aware of the massive secret I held over her head, her words did not hurt me. They just proved that my plan to dismantle her fake reality was entirely justified. I looked at her manicured finger pointing at my chest and felt absolutely nothing but cold, calculating resolve. I did not flinch. I did not drop my gaze. I simply stared back at my mother and let the silence stretch out between us. My utter lack of an emotional response infuriated her even more. She was entirely used to me crumbling under her verbal assaults. Whenever we had a disagreement in the past, a few harsh words about my appearance or my personality were usually enough to make me apologize, just to keep the peace. When she realized her cruel words were bouncing off me like water against a stone, she let out an exasperated, theatrical scoff. She spun around on her expensive designer heels, preparing to dramatically storm out of my living room. But as she turned, she deliberately swung her heavy leather handbag in a wide, vicious arc. The heavy brass hardware on her bag struck the pedestal table sitting near the entryway. Resting on that table was a hand-painted ceramic vase Nolan had bought for me during a trip to Santa Fe for our first anniversary. It was painted with vibrant desert colors and was a beautiful symbol of the peaceful life we were building together. The impact sent the vase toppling over the edge. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp, deafening crash, shattering into dozens of jagged painted shards. The sound echoed through the quiet condo. I looked down at the broken pieces scattering across the polished oak. My mother did not gasp or apologize. She did not even look surprised. She glanced down at the destruction she had just caused, and then looked back up at me with a cold, defiant sneer. She adjusted her tailored coat and told me that I should not leave cheap clutter lying around if I did not want it broken. She said the shattered mess was a perfect metaphor for my life, entirely fragile and completely worthless without my family to prop me up. Nolan walked out of the kitchen holding a dish towel. He saw the shattered ceramic and the smug, entitled look on my mother's face. A lesser man would have yelled. A lesser man would have demanded she leave the premises immediately or threatened to call the building security. But Nolan operates on a completely different frequency of power. He calmly walked over to the hallway closet, pulled out a broom and a dustpan, and began sweeping up the shards. He did not say a single word to her. His absolute refusal to engage with her toxic drama was the ultimate insult to a woman who desperately feeds on conflict and attention. My mother realized she had lost total control of the room. She looked at Sienna and gave a sharp, commanding nod. Sienna stepped forward and threw the thick manila folder she had been clutching onto my marble kitchen island. It landed with a heavy, authoritative thud. Sienna crossed her arms and told me that I needed to stop acting like a jealous child and start acting like a supportive sister. She said the folder contained the official business prospectus for Trey's new tech startup. My mother stepped right up to the kitchen island, tapping her perfectly manicured nails against the manila envelope. She dropped her voice into a hard, demanding tone. She ordered me to take that prospectus into my office on Monday morning and use my position as a senior auditor to fast-track it for a corporate development grant. My firm manages a massive venture capital fund designed to seed local technology startups. And my mother somehow thought she could bully me into handing over hundreds of thousands of corporate dollars to a man who had just stolen my wedding fund. She looked me dead in the eyes and issued her final ultimatum. She told me that if I did not secure that funding for Trey by the end of the month, she and my father would officially disown me. She threatened to completely cut me out of the family, strip me of my inheritance, and ensure that not a single relative attended my pathetic courthouse wedding. She said I had one last chance to prove my absolute loyalty to the family, and that I better not waste it. She told me to remember exactly who gave me the life I had, and who could take it all away. I looked at the folder, and then back at her. I simply said goodbye, Diane. The use of her first name hit her like a physical blow. Her eyes widened in genuine shock, but she quickly recovered, lifting her chin in arrogant defiance. She turned on her heel and marched out the front door with Sienna trailing right behind her like an obedient shadow. The heavy door slammed shut behind them, rattling the picture frames in the hallway. The sudden silence in the condo was profound. Nolan finished sweeping up the last of the ceramic dust and dumped it into the trash can. He washed his hands, dried them on a towel, and walked over to where I was standing. He wrapped his arms around my waist and rested his chin on my shoulder. He softly asked me if I was okay. I leaned back into his solid, reassuring presence and took a deep breath. I told him I had honestly never been better. I stepped away from him and walked over to the kitchen island. I stared at the manila folder sitting under the warm pendant lights. They had come into my sanctuary, insulted my relationship, broken my belongings, and threatened to disown me over a corporate grant. They thought the threat of losing my family would terrify me into submission. They did not understand that I was already planning the funeral for our relationship. I reached out and flipped open the heavy cardstock cover of the prospectus. The first page featured a glossy, high-resolution photo of Trey standing in front of a sleek rented sports car wearing a custom suit. The executive summary boasted about disruptive technology and decentralized financial ecosystems, using dozens of meaningless buzzwords designed to confuse amateur investors. But I am not an amateur. I am a forensic accountant. I do not read buzzwords. I read numbers. I pulled out a stool and sat down at the island. I told Nolan to pour me a fresh cup of coffee because I was going to be busy. I started flipping through the dense financial projections, balance sheets, and asset declarations. Within the first 10 pages, my trained eyes caught the first glaring inconsistency. Trey's projected revenue streams were completely fabricated based on non-existent beta testing numbers and highly inflated user acquisition costs. But that was just standard tech startup exaggeration. I needed to find the real crime. I needed to find the solid legal leverage. I turned to the final section of the prospectus, which detailed the collateral and asset guarantees. In order to secure the massive corporate grant my mother was demanding, Trey had to prove he had the personal assets to back up the initial business loan. I scanned the list of declared properties and bank accounts, and then my finger stopped on the third line of the asset declaration page. I stared at the address printed in bold black ink. I read it twice to make sure my eyes were not playing tricks on me. A slow, dark smile spread across my face. Trey had listed a piece of high-value suburban real estate as his primary collateral to guarantee his massive venture capital loan. He had claimed full legal ownership of my parents' sprawling house, the exact same house that legally belonged to my blind limited liability company. I closed the folder and tapped my fingers against the cover. My mother had just threatened to disown me if I did not help her golden child secure a massive financial windfall. But by forcing this prospectus into my hands, she had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them all. The trap had not just been set. The mice had walked right in and handed me the remote control to the steel cage. I sat perfectly still under the warm glow of the kitchen pendant lights, tracing the printed address with my index finger. The sheer magnitude of Trey's stupidity was almost difficult to process. I am a senior forensic accountant, and my entire career is built on dismantling complex webs of corporate deceit hidden within thousands of pages of financial jargon. I have uncovered offshore shell companies and multi-million-dollar embezzlement rings orchestrated by brilliant executives. But what Trey had handed me was not brilliant. It was the financial equivalent of a child using crayons to forge a banknote. He had boldly listed my parents' sprawling suburban house as the primary collateral for a massive venture capital loan. The exact same house that legally belonged to my blind limited liability company, Apex Financial. I opened my laptop and bypassed my standard personal accounts, logging directly into the secure private network I use for remote auditing. I needed to see exactly how far Trey had taken this lie. I pulled up the County Recorder of Deeds portal and entered the parcel identification number for my parents' property. The official state records clearly showed the original mortgage default and the subsequent transfer of the debt to Apex Financial 3 years ago. The chain of title was absolute and legally binding. Then I turned my attention back to the thick manila folder Sienna had slammed onto my kitchen counter. I flipped past the glossy executive summaries and the ridiculous pages filled with meaningless tech buzzwords until I reached the appendix. This was the section where Trey had to provide physical proof of his assets to secure the corporate grant my mother was demanding I approve. He had included a photocopy of a warranty deed. I slid the paper out of the plastic sleeve and held it up to the light. It took me exactly 10 seconds to identify the forgery. The margins on the document were misaligned by a fraction of an inch. The font used for the parcel identification number did not match the official typeface used by the county clerk's office. But the most glaring mistake was the notary seal stamped at the bottom of the page. It was completely flat, lacking the textured indentation of a genuine physical stamp. He had simply found a digital image of a notary seal online, photoshopped it onto a fake deed, and printed it out on heavy cardstock. Trey had not just lied on a loan application, he had actively fabricated government documents to claim ownership of a $2 million estate that did not belong to him. He had committed federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and felony forgery, all in a desperate attempt to look like a wealthy tech visionary. I called Nolan over to the kitchen island. I did not say a word. I simply slid the forged warranty deed across the marble counter and pointed to the address. Nolan picked up the document and adjusted his glasses. As a corporate attorney who deals with high-stakes mergers and acquisitions, Nolan has a mind like a steel trap. He read the document twice and then looked down at the county records glowing on my laptop screen. Nolan let out a low, sharp exhale. He leaned his hands against the counter and shook his head in absolute disbelief. He pointed to the digital notary seal and listed the exact federal statutes Trey had violated. He explained that submitting forged real estate collateral across state lines to a federally insured financial institution carried a mandatory minimum sentence in federal prison. We spent the next 3 hours dissecting every single page of Trey's business prospectus. It was a masterclass in absolute delusion. I traced his claimed revenue streams and found that they were entirely based on non-existent beta testing numbers and highly inflated user acquisition metrics. I looked at his declared liquid assets, which consisted of screenshots of cryptocurrency wallets that lacked verifiable blockchain ledger addresses. He had also listed 3 separate holding companies registered in Delaware that I quickly discovered had zero operating history and were entirely dormant. Trey was not a tech entrepreneur. He was a highly charismatic con artist running a sophisticated shell game. He was using Sienna's fake social media influencer lifestyle to project an image of wealth and success to lure in desperate investors. And my parents were completely blinded by his tailored suits and his aggressive confidence. They were so desperate to secure a wealthy son-in-law that they never bothered to ask for proof of his claims. But the most terrifying realization was not Trey's criminality. It was my mother's absolute willingness to sacrifice me for him. I looked at the corporate grant application tucked into the back of the folder. My mother had stood in my living room, broken a beautiful piece of art, and threatened to permanently disown me if I did not take this folder into my office and use my professional reputation to fast-track his funding. My firm is one of the most ruthless restructuring agencies in the country. We manage a highly regulated venture capital fund designed to seed legitimate local technology startups. If I had caved to my mother's emotional abuse, if I had blindly stamped my approval on this prospectus just to win her fleeting affection, I would have been directly tying my name to a massive federal crime. When my firm's compliance department inevitably audited the grant and discovered the forged real estate documents, they would not care that Trey was my future brother-in-law. They would immediately assume I was a co-conspirator. I would be stripped of my accounting license, fired from my senior position, and potentially indicted alongside him for facilitating wire fraud. My mother was completely willing to risk my entire career, my absolute freedom, and my flawless professional reputation just so her golden child could have a destination wedding and a wealthy husband. She did not care if I went to federal prison as long as Sienna got her honeymoon in Maui. The profound weight of that realization settled over me, but it did not bring tears. It brought a supreme icy clarity. For 35 years, I had tried to prove my worth to people who viewed my existence as nothing more than a convenient resource to be exploited. I had paid their mortgage out of a misplaced sense of filial duty. I had absorbed their insults to keep the peace. I had smiled through their blatant favoritism. But demanding I commit a federal felony to fund my own replacement was the absolute final line. I closed the manila folder and neatly squared the edges against the marble counter. I looked at Nolan, who was watching me with a quiet, fierce pride. He knew exactly what was running through my mind. He knew that the woman my family had bullied and underestimated for 3 decades was gone forever. I told Nolan that I was going to do exactly what my mother asked. I was going to take the prospectus into my office on Monday morning. But I was not going to take it to the corporate grant committee. I was going to take it directly to the highest level of our internal legal compliance department. I was going to hand them the forged documents, the fake notary seal, and the fraudulent asset declarations on a silver platter. I packed the manila folder into my leather work briefcase and snapped the brass locks shut. The ambient noise of the city hummed outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of my condo. My family was out there sleeping soundly in a house they did not own, dreaming of an Italian wedding they could not afford, funded by a tech empire that did not exist. They felt completely invincible wrapped in their arrogant delusion. They had absolutely no idea that I had just spent my Saturday night drafting the blueprints for their complete and utter destruction. I walked into the bedroom, turned off the lights, and slept better than I had in my entire life. Tomorrow was Monday, and I had a very important meeting with my legal team. I walked into the towering glass atrium of my corporate office building on Monday morning with a completely different energy than I had ever felt before. For years, I had entered these doors, carrying the heavy, invisible weight of my family's expectations. I worked 60-hour weeks to earn the massive corporate bonuses that secretly funded their lavish suburban lifestyle and kept them out of bankruptcy. But today, that invisible weight was completely gone. My leather briefcase felt heavy in my hand, but my steps were incredibly light. I was no longer the obedient scapegoat trying to buy the love of people who despised me. I was a senior forensic accountant, and I was about to do my job. My first meeting of the day was a private appointment with my personal real estate attorney. I had asked Nolan to join me not as my fiancé, but as my legal counsel for Apex Financial, the blind limited liability company I had used to buy my parents' defaulted mortgage 3 years ago. We sat in a quiet, soundproof conference room overlooking the Chicago skyline. I opened my laptop and pulled up the financial ledgers for Apex Financial. I turned the screen toward my attorney and showed him the exact transaction history. For 24 consecutive months, I had been manually transferring thousands of dollars from my personal savings into the holding account to cover my parents' missed payments. I had absorbed their property taxes, their insurance premiums, and their massive interest rates, all while they treated me like a disappointing burden. I looked at the total amount I had sacrificed for them over the years. It was enough money to buy a second home in cash. And in return, they had stolen my $50,000 wedding fund to pay for my sister's vacation and demanded I give up my honeymoon. I looked at my attorney and told him to draft a formal notice of default. I instructed him to trigger the acceleration clause in the mortgage contract, which legally required the entire remaining balance of the $2 million loan to be paid in full immediately. I told him to completely terminate the grace period I had secretly extended to them and to file the official foreclosure paperwork with the county recorder of deeds by the end of the business day. My attorney printed out the authorization forms and slid them across the polished mahogany table. He handed me a heavy silver pen. I did not hesitate. I did not feel a single drop of guilt or sadness. I signed my name on the dotted line with absolute steady precision. The moment the ink dried on that paper, the financial safety net I had woven for my parents was officially destroyed. The bank would be sending the brightly colored eviction notices directly to their front door within a matter of days. I thanked my attorney, packed away the documents, and prepared for the second phase of the morning. I took the elevator up to the executive floor and walked directly into the office of the senior managing partner of my firm. Our compliance division is one of the most ruthless in the financial sector. We manage billions of dollars in venture capital assets, and we have an absolute zero-tolerance policy for fraud. I sat down across from the managing partner and unlatched my briefcase. I pulled out the thick manila folder my mother had arrogantly ordered me to approve and placed it squarely on his desk. I did not give him any emotional backstory about my toxic family dynamic. In the corporate world, emotions are a liability. I simply presented the facts. I told him that the man my sister was marrying had submitted this prospectus to our internal grant committee. I explained that upon a routine preliminary review, I had discovered multiple severe financial discrepancies. Then I handed him the forged warranty deed and the fake digital notary seal. The managing partner adjusted his glasses and studied the documents. He did not need a magnifying glass to see the blatant forgery. The misaligned margins and the flat digitally printed seal were insulting to anyone who worked in finance. I watched his expression shift from mild curiosity to cold professional fury. I then handed him the cross-referenced property records proving that the $2 million estate Trey was claiming as his own collateral legally belonged to an external holding company. I did not need to tell him that I owned the holding company. All that mattered was that Trey was actively committing federal wire fraud and attempting to use our firm to legitimize his scam. The managing partner looked up at me and thanked me for catching the fraud before the grant committee processed the application. He treated me with a level of profound professional respect that my family had never once shown me. He immediately picked up his desk phone and initiated a priority conference call with our entire legal compliance team. The dominoes were now officially in motion and they were falling fast. Our legal team drafted an immediate high-priority fraud alert. Because Trey was actively attempting to secure a massive loan through our corporate grant program using forged government documents, my firm was legally obligated to report him. I sat in the room while our lead compliance officer dialed the direct line for the federal banking regulators. He provided them with Trey's full name, his dormant shell companies, and the exact details of his falsified asset declarations. But the most devastating blow was yet to come. The primary venture capital group Trey had been aggressively courting to fund his tech startup was a firm called Horizon Equity. They were a ruthless, high-profile investment group that prided themselves on their rigorous due diligence. They also happened to be one of our most lucrative corporate clients. My managing partner dialed the lead director at Horizon Equity and put him on speakerphone. When my boss calmly explained that their new star tech entrepreneur had submitted forged real estate collateral to our grant program, the reaction on the other end of the line was explosive. The director at Horizon Equity was absolutely livid. He realized that Trey was running a sophisticated shell game using fake assets to secure millions of dollars in real funding. The director immediately ordered his team to freeze all pending contracts with Trey's startup. He stated clearly over the phone that they were pulling his funding entirely and blacklisting his name across their entire investment network. I sat quietly in my leather chair listening to the systematic dismantling of Trey's entire future. In less than 3 hours, I had completely erased the fake empire he was building. He had no funding, he had no startup, and very soon he was going to have federal investigators knocking on his door. I walked out of the executive office and returned to my own desk. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling city below. My family was out there somewhere completely oblivious to the massive storm that was currently gathering right above their heads. My mother was likely at her country club bragging to her wealthy friends about the destination wedding she had just funded with my stolen money. Sienna was probably shopping for designer luggage for a honeymoon she was never going to take. and Trey was undoubtedly strutting around town boasting about his billion-dollar tech valuation that had just vanished into thin air. They felt completely invincible. They genuinely believed that they could treat me like garbage, steal my inheritance, break my belongings, and threaten my career without facing a single consequence. They thought I was too weak and too desperate for their love to ever fight back. They had mistaken my years of quiet patience for absolute submission. I sat down at my computer and opened my calendar. The week ahead was completely clear. I had successfully halted the mortgage payments, reported the felony fraud, and severed their financial lifelines. The trap was fully mobilized. The steel cage had dropped. There was absolutely nothing left for me to do but sit back, wait for the impending collision, and decide exactly what I was going to wear to Sienna's lavish engagement gala. While I was at the office finalizing the legal destruction of his fraudulent empire, Trey was growing increasingly desperate. Since I had completely ignored his text messages and phone calls demanding I secure his downtown office lease, he decided to pivot his strategy. He assumed that because I was a woman, I could easily be managed if he simply intimidated my partner. He tracked Nolan down during his lunch break. Nolan works as a senior associate at a prestigious corporate law firm in the financial district. He is a man who negotiates multi-million-dollar mergers before noon. He is not someone who gets intimidated by a man wearing rented designer sneakers. Nolan later recounted the entire interaction to me with a mixture of profound amusement and genuine pity. Nolan had been sitting at a quiet corner table in his favorite upscale coffee shop a block away from his firm. He was reviewing a dense stack of contract revisions while sipping a black coffee. The shop was hushed, filled with the low hum of espresso machines and the quiet chatter of investment bankers. The peace was shattered when Trey confidently slid into the chair directly opposite Nolan without an invitation. Trey did not bother to take off his mirrored sunglasses. He leaned back in the wooden chair, crossing his arms and projecting the unearned arrogance of a man playing with Monopoly money. He looked at Nolan's tailored charcoal suit and the neat stack of legal documents and actually smirked. He told Nolan that he looked like a classic wage slave working himself to the bone just to make the senior partners rich. Trey boasted that he was operating on a completely different level of wealth generation. He started throwing around meaningless buzzwords talking about decentralized blockchain synergy and projected crypto wealth that would make Nolan's salary look like pocket change. Nolan did not interrupt him. He simply placed his pen down on top of his documents, folded his hands together, and let Trey dig his own grave. When Trey finished his ridiculous monologue about his imaginary tech empire, he finally got to the point. He dropped his voice into what he clearly thought was a dominant masculine tone. He told Nolan that he needed to get his future wife in line. He claimed that my refusal to secure his office lease and fast-track his corporate grant was petty, jealous, and completely unprofessional. Trey actually had the audacity to tell Nolan that it was his job as the man of the relationship to control my emotions. He said that if Nolan did not force me to sign off on the business lease and the venture capital grant by the end of the week, the entire family was going to officially cut us off. He threatened to revoke our invitation to the upcoming destination wedding in Italy and ensure that we were blacklisted from every major family event for the rest of our lives. He leaned across the small table, pointing a finger at Nolan, and told him to make the smart play before he ended up marrying a bitter outcast. Nolan has always possessed a quiet, steady confidence that absolutely terrifies deeply insecure men. He did not get angry. He did not raise his voice or bother to defend his highly successful career. He did not even flinch at the threat of being cut off from a family he secretly despised anyway. Nolan simply reached into his pocket, pulled out a $10 bill, and placed it on the table to cover his coffee. He picked up his briefcase and stood up, looking down at Trey with a perfectly pleasant smile. He did not give Trey a lecture about respect or family loyalty. Nolan looked him dead in the eyes and delivered a single devastating line. He told Trey that he should probably start saving every single dollar he had right now. He casually suggested that Trey was going to need a very expensive federal defense attorney in the near future and mentioned that his own firm charged $1,000 an hour for criminal fraud consultations. Trey scoffed loudly, calling Nolan a jealous loser as Nolan walked out of the coffee shop. Trey sat there in his designer streetwear, genuinely believing he had won the interaction. He thought Nolan was just making a pathetic, empty threat to defend my honor. He had absolutely no idea that Nolan had already reviewed the extensive felony fraud alert my firm had submitted to the federal banking regulators that exact same morning. He had no idea that the venture capital firm he was bragging about had already blacklisted his name and frozen his accounts. When Nolan came home that evening and told me the story, we shared a quiet laugh in our kitchen. The sheer delusion of a man threatening us with exile from a family we were actively foreclosing on was almost poetic. But the universe has a funny way of delivering the perfect punchline at the exact right moment. While we were standing at the kitchen island, my phone buzzed with an automated notification from my building's concierge desk. They had just delivered the daily mail to my private box. I took the elevator down to the lobby and retrieved a thick stack of envelopes. Most of it was standard junk mail and professional correspondence, but buried in the middle was a heavy, oversized envelope made of expensive textured cardstock. I brought the mail back up to the condo and tossed the thick envelope onto the counter. It was stamped with a custom gold wax seal featuring Sienna's newly designed monogram. I picked up a silver letter opener and broke the heavy wax seal. I slid out an incredibly lavish multi-page invitation. It was printed on gold-foiled paper with raised cursive lettering. It was the official invitation for Sienna's highly anticipated engagement gala. I read through the extravagant details. The gala was going to be held at the Oak Ridge Country Club, the most exclusive and expensive private venue in the entire city. The invitation boasted about a sprawling champagne fountain, a 5-course catered dinner featuring dry-aged beef, and a live 10-piece jazz band. It was designed to look like a royal decree rather than a simple party invitation. At the very bottom, it politely requested an RSVP by the end of the week. I stood there in my quiet kitchen staring at the gold foil lettering. I knew exactly how this extravagant party was being funded. Every single drop of vintage champagne poured into those crystal glasses, every single note played by that jazz band, and every single piece of expensive cardstock sitting in my hands was being paid for by my stolen wedding fund. My parents had drained the $50,000 trust account my grandfather had left for me, added their own depleted savings, and handed it all to Sienna just to fund this exact party. They were throwing a massive, lavish event to celebrate a fraudulent tech bro and a selfish social media influencer. They desperately wanted a captive audience of wealthy peers to witness their fake success and applaud their stolen wealth. They had invited me expecting me to either cower in shame and decline or show up and sit quietly in the corner while they flaunted my money in my face. I decided it was only fair to give them exactly what they wanted. They wanted an audience for their grand theater of delusion, and I was more than happy to secure my front row seat. I walked over to my desk and took a black fountain pen from the drawer. I pulled out the small, elegant RSVP card included in the envelope. I checked the box confirming my attendance with absolute certainty. Then I moved to the blank line designated for a +1. I did not write Nolan's name. I wanted them to know exactly what was coming the moment I walked through those country club doors. With slow, deliberate strokes, I wrote down a single word: attorney. I slid the card back into the return envelope, sealed it tight, and left it by the front door to be mailed first thing in the morning. I looked out the window at the glittering city lights. The trap was fully operational. The legal documents were filed. The federal regulators were notified. And now my attendance was officially confirmed. All that was left to do was pick out the perfect dress for the absolute destruction of my family. Saturday evening arrived with a crisp chill in the air. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror adjusting a delicate diamond necklace Nolan had gifted me for my recent promotion. I was wearing a tailored emerald green silk gown that draped perfectly to the floor. It was not the dress of a defeated outcast. It was the armor of a woman stepping onto a battlefield she had already won. Nolan walked into the room wearing a sharp charcoal suit and handed me my evening clutch. He did not ask if I was ready or nervous. He just smiled and opened the front door. We pulled up to the grand entrance of the Oak Ridge Country Club just as the sun was setting. The sheer scale of my parents' financial delusion was on full display before we even handed our keys to the valet. Two massive ice sculptures carved into the shapes of intertwined swans flanked the grand mahogany doors. A string quartet played classical music on the terrace, and waiters in crisp white tuxedos carried silver trays of vintage champagne to arriving guests. Every single detail, from the imported floral arrangements to the premium valet service, had been paid for by my stolen wedding fund. When Nolan and I walked into the main ballroom, the ambient chatter noticeably dipped. My mother Diane was standing near a massive champagne fountain, wearing a heavily sequined silver gown that caught the light with every movement. She spotted me, and her fake socialite smile completely vanished for a fraction of a second. She quickly recovered, leaning over to whisper something to my father Richard, who immediately scowled in our direction. They had clearly assumed my RSVP was a bluff. They thought I would be too intimidated and too heartbroken to actually show my face at a party funded by my own stolen inheritance. My mother glided over to us, projecting her voice, so the nearby wealthy guests could hear her performative motherly warmth. She loudly thanked me for coming and said it was so brave of me to show up despite my recent financial struggles and my obvious jealousy. I did not give her the satisfaction of looking hurt. I just smiled with cold, detached amusement. I thanked her for the warm welcome and complimented the ice sculptures, noting how incredibly expensive they must have been. Her eyes narrowed, but before she could snap back, a photographer pulled her away for a group picture with Trey's family. Nolan and I checked the gold-trimmed seating chart displayed on an ornate easel near the entrance. It was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive family politics. Sienna and Trey were seated at a massive elevated head table covered in white roses, alongside my parents and Trey's parents. The rest of our wealthy relatives and Trey's venture capital friends occupied the premium tables, ringing the polished wooden dance floor. Nolan and I had been assigned to table 14. It was the furthest possible table from the stage, pushed directly against the swinging wooden doors of the catering kitchen. Every time a waiter rushed in or out to serve food, the doors would violently swing open, hitting the back of my chair. As we sat down, my Aunt Patricia drifted over holding a martini glass. She looked at me with deep, exaggerated pity. She sighed heavily and said that my mother had told everyone about my little tantrum at the steakhouse. Patricia patted my shoulder condescendingly and told me that it was perfectly natural to feel jealous of Sienna's massive success, but that I needed to stop acting out and making a fool of myself in public. She told me that family requires sacrifice and that my refusal to be a team player was deeply embarrassing for my father. I did not defend myself or try to explain the truth. I just took a sip of my sparkling water and told Patricia to pay very close attention to the speeches later. Dinner was a lavish 5-course affair featuring lobster bisque and dry-aged beef Wellington. I ate quietly, watching the room. I watched my father buy rounds of expensive scotch for his golfing buddies, playing the role of the generous self-made patriarch. I watched Sienna pose for dozens of photos, flashing her massive diamond ring for her social media followers. I watched Trey work the room, shaking hands with men in expensive suits, loudly pitching his tech startup as the next billion-dollar unicorn. It was a beautifully orchestrated theater of absolute delusion. When the dessert plates were cleared, the heavy crystal chandeliers dimmed, and a single bright spotlight hit the main stage. The room grew quiet as my father took the microphone. He gave a long, boastful speech about how proud he was to fund this incredible night for his beautiful daughter and his brilliant future son-in-law. He talked about legacy and building a dynasty, completely ignoring the fact that the bank was currently processing the foreclosure on his only real asset. Then it was Sienna's turn. She practically floated up to the microphone, wiping a fake tear from her perfectly contoured face. She thanked our parents for their endless generosity and their unwavering belief in her brand. But Sienna could never just take a victory gracefully. She had to twist the knife to make herself feel superior. She looked directly across the dark room toward table 14. She smiled sweetly into the microphone and said that true wealth is about family and taking massive risks. She said that some people only care about spreadsheets and hoarding pennies, living small, boring lives, because they are too afraid to dream big. She actually looked at the crowd and joked that she was just glad I finally dressed up and left my cubicle for the night, even if I could not afford to chip in for the champagne. A ripple of polite, restrained laughter echoed through the ballroom. My parents beamed with pride from the head table. Aunt Patricia shook her head in amusement from a few tables away. Nolan tightened his grip on my hand beneath the table, but his face remained perfectly calm. Finally, Trey took the stage. He adjusted his designer jacket and leaned into the microphone with the practiced arrogance of a man who firmly believed his own lies. He thanked Sienna for being his muse. Then he launched into a full corporate pitch for his startup, treating the engagement party like an investor meeting. He bragged that he had just secured a massive multi-million-dollar valuation from Horizon Equity. He talked about how traditional banking was dead and how visionary thinkers like him were the future of wealth distribution. He even patted my father on the back, thanking him for being an early-stage angel investor, when in reality, my father was just a desperate man giving away my money. Trey then shaded his eyes from the bright spotlight and pointed directly toward my table in the back. The entire room turned in their chairs to look at me. Trey laughed into the microphone and said that since he and Sienna were about to be the new power couple of the city, he wanted to extend an olive branch to the less fortunate members of the family. He condescendingly offered me a job doing his basic bookkeeping once his company went public, so I could finally experience what real financial success looked like. The room erupted into genuine laughter. 150 guests laughing at the boring, frugal spinster sister who was sitting by the kitchen doors. My mother looked at me with absolute triumph. She thought she had won. She thought she had successfully crushed my spirit in front of everyone who mattered in her superficial world. She thought this public humiliation would finally force me into permanent submission. I did not cry. I did not look away. I simply pushed my chair back and stood up. The laughter slowly died down as I stepped away from the table. People expected me to run out of the ballroom in tears just like my mother had conditioned me to do when I was younger. But I did not walk toward the exit. I walked straight toward the stage. I felt the collective gaze of 150 wealthy socialites tracking my every movement. I saw my mother half stand up from her chair, her mouth opening to say something to stop me, but she was frozen by the sheer confidence in my posture. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor, cutting through the sudden heavy silence of the room. I reached into my emerald green designer clutch and pulled out a thick stack of legally binding documents. I walked up the 3 carpeted steps onto the stage. Trey looked confused, stepping back as I approached him. I did not ask for permission, and I did not wait for him to hand me the microphone. I simply reached out and took it from his hand. I turned to face the crowd, looking directly at my parents, who were suddenly sitting perfectly rigid in their chairs. I tapped the top of the microphone twice. It echoed loudly through the silent ballroom. The time for hiding was over. The sharp tap of my fingernail against the microphone reverberated through the Oak Ridge Country Club ballroom. 150 pairs of eyes stared at me in stunned silence. Nobody moved. The waiters stood frozen, holding their silver trays. My mother looked like all the air had been violently sucked out of her lungs. She gripped the edge of the head table, her knuckles turning completely white. Trey stood awkwardly a few feet away from me, shifting his weight from side to side. I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of an auditor who had just found the missing millions. I spoke clearly and evenly, ensuring my voice reached every single corner of the massive room. I started by thanking my parents. I told the crowd that Richard and Diane had truly outdone themselves this time. I pointed to the towering ice sculptures and the endless flow of expensive champagne. I said it was a breathtaking display of wealth and generosity, especially considering they had just gifted my sister a $75,000 check at a steakhouse the night before. A murmur of impressed approval rippled through the audience of wealthy socialites and venture capitalists. My parents forced tight, stiff smiles, trying to maintain their wealthy facade in front of their peers. Then I dropped the first match. I looked directly at my father and said that their generosity was actually nothing short of a financial miracle. I explained that it was a miracle because my parents had not paid their $2 million mortgage in exactly 24 months. The murmured approval in the room instantly vanished, replaced by a sharp collective gasp. My father's face drained of all color, turning an ashen gray. He tried to stand up, but his legs seemed to give out, and he sank heavily back into his chair. My mother opened her mouth to scream at me, but no sound came out. I held up the first legal document from my stack. I announced to the room that 3 years ago, when my father nearly bankrupted the family to pay for Sienna's lavish lifestyle, a private holding company called Apex Financial had stepped in to buy their defaulted debt. I told the crowd that my parents believed a generous investment firm was covering their missed payments and saving them from the humiliation of eviction. I took a step closer to the edge of the stage. I looked my mother dead in the eyes and told her that Apex Financial was my private company. I told her that for 2 years I had been using my corporate bonuses to secretly pay for the very roof over her head. I told the entire room that my parents had stolen my $50,000 wedding trust fund to pay for this exact party while I was literally paying their property taxes. Aunt Patricia, who had just mocked me an hour earlier, actually dropped her martini glass. It shattered against the hardwood floor, but nobody even looked her way. The silence in the room was absolute and terrifying. I raised the legal document higher. I announced that as of yesterday afternoon, the secret grace period was officially over. I told my parents that I had filed the foreclosure paperwork with the county recorder of deeds and that the bank would be serving them with eviction notices by Wednesday. I told them they had exactly 30 days to vacate my property. Sienna burst into tears, real tears this time. She grabbed Trey's arm, shaking him frantically, demanding to know what was going on. That was my cue to pivot. I turned away from my devastated parents and faced Trey. He was sweating. The confident, arrogant tech bro who had just offered me a bookkeeping job looked like a cornered animal. He took a step back, holding his hands up defensively. I told Trey that I had carefully reviewed his generous employment offer, but I had to decline. I explained that as a senior forensic accountant, I had a strict personal policy against working for federal criminals. The venture capitalists sitting at the front tables suddenly sat up completely straight. Trey stammered, telling me to shut my mouth and demanding someone cut the microphone. But nobody moved. The sound engineer was too paralyzed by the unfolding drama to touch the mixing board. I pulled the second document from my clutch. It was the forged warranty deed. I held it out toward Trey so he could see his own sloppy Photoshop work. I told the entire room that in order to secure his massive venture capital funding, Trey had submitted falsified asset declarations. I explained that he had listed my property, the house owned by my limited liability company, as his own personal collateral. I told the crowd about the fake digital notary seal and the fabricated revenue streams. I then looked directly at the table where the executives from Trey's target investment firm were sitting. I told them that my corporate restructuring firm was the one managing the grant he applied for. I announced that I had personally handed his forged documents to our compliance department yesterday morning. Trey lunged forward, trying to grab the microphone from my hand, but Nolan materialized out of nowhere. Nolan stepped smoothly between us, placing a firm, solid hand on Trey's chest and pushing him back with effortless strength. Nolan did not say a word. The cold warning in his eyes was more than enough. Trey stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. I stepped around Nolan and delivered the final fatal blow. I looked Trey up and down with absolute disgust. I told him that our managing partner had already contacted Horizon Equity. I announced to the room of his peers and potential investors that Horizon Equity had completely pulled his funding, frozen his pending contracts, and blacklisted his name across their entire network. I told him that federal banking regulators had already opened an investigation into his wire fraud and that he should probably use the rest of Sienna's stolen wedding fund to hire a very good defense attorney. The ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. The wealthy investors Trey had invited immediately stood up, grabbing their coats and rushing toward the exit, wanting absolutely nothing to do with a federal fraud investigation. Sienna's crying escalated into a full-blown hysterical scream. She began hitting Trey's chest, demanding to know if he was completely broke. Trey was frantically backing away from her, pulling out his phone with shaking hands, trying to call his frozen bank accounts. My father was staring blankly ahead, completely broken by the realization that his country club friends had just witnessed his total financial ruin. My mother was sobbing, her face buried in her hands, the glittering facade of her perfect, wealthy life smashed into a million unrecoverable pieces. I did not stay to watch them clean up the wreckage. I had delivered the truth, and my work was done. I lowered the microphone and gently placed it onto the wooden podium. I turned my back on the screaming, the crying, and the complete destruction of the family that had spent 35 years trying to make me feel worthless. Nolan offered me his arm. I took it and we walked slowly down the center aisle of the ballroom. The remaining guests parted for us like the Red Sea, stepping aside with wide eyes and shocked whispers. Nobody tried to stop me. Nobody asked for an apology. They just watched the boring, frugal spinster sister walk out the door, having executed the most flawless financial takedown they would ever witness in their entire lives. We walked out the grand mahogany doors and into the cool, crisp autumn night. The valet brought Nolan's car around immediately. As we drove away from the Oak Ridge Country Club, leaving the chaotic, flashing lights of the venue behind us, I rolled down my window. I took a deep breath of the fresh night air. The heavy, invisible weight that had crushed my chest since childhood was permanently gone. I looked over at Nolan, who was driving with a quiet, proud smile on his face. He reached over and took my hand, squeezing it gently. I leaned my head back against the leather seat, finally free. I walked straight to the front of the room, my heels clicking deliberately against the polished wood floor. The silence in the ballroom was absolute heavy, with the expectation of a dramatic meltdown. They thought I was going to cry. They thought I was going to scream about how unfair it was that they had given away my wedding fund. But I wasn't there for a tantrum, I was there for an execution. I reached the stage and stepped up, bypassing Trey entirely. He looked confused, taking a half step back as I approached the podium. I didn't ask for permission. I simply reached out and picked up the spare microphone resting on the stand. I turned to face the crowd, sweeping my gaze across the sea of bewildered faces, the venture capitalists, the country club socialites, the relatives who had spent years pitying me. Finally, I locked eyes with my parents, who were suddenly sitting rigid in their seats. I tapped the top of the microphone twice. The sharp sound echoed loudly through the silent ballroom, snapping everyone to attention. I smiled, a calm, measured smile that didn't reach my eyes. I'd like to start by congratulating Sienna and Trey. I began, my voice clear and perfectly steady. And I'd like to applaud my parents, Richard and Diane, for funding such a beautiful evening. It truly is a spectacular display of generosity. I paused, letting the polite, slightly confused applause ripple through the room. My mother's expression tightened into a mask of pure panic. She knew that tone. It was the tone I used when I had found a critical error in a financial audit. Just last night, I continued pacing slowly across the stage. My parents presented Sienna and Trey with a $75,000 check to fund their destination wedding and lifestyle brand. It was a touching moment. I looked directly at Sienna, who was clutching her champagne glass so tightly her knuckles were white. A massive investment in the golden child. I stopped pacing and turned back to the center of the stage. The pleasant demeanor dropped, replaced by the icy precision of a senior forensic accountant. But what makes that gift truly remarkable, I said, my voice dropping an octave, carrying to every corner of the room, is that it was funded by an account my grandfather specifically left to me, combined with the last remaining dollars of my parents' savings. A low murmur started to build among the guests. Aunt Patricia leaned forward, her eyes wide. "And why is that so remarkable?" I asked the crowd, feigning innocence. "Because, ladies and gentlemen, Richard and Diane haven't paid their mortgage in exactly 24 months. The ballroom erupted in a collective sharp intake of breath. My father's face drained of color, turning an ashen, sickly gray. He tried to stand up, gripping the edge of the head table, but his legs seemed to fail him, and he sank back heavily into his chair. My mother opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked as if she had been physically struck. I didn't give them a moment to recover. I reached into my emerald green designer clutch and pulled out a thick stack of legally binding documents, the crisp white paper standing out starkly under the stage lights. 3 years ago, I announced, holding up the first document, when my father nearly bankrupted the family. To maintain this beautiful illusion of wealth, a private holding company called Apex Financial stepped in. They bought my parents' defaulted debt, saving them from the humiliation of immediate eviction. I took a deliberate step closer to the edge of the stage, my eyes locked on my mother. They believed a generous investment firm was covering their missed payments. I said, the silence in the room now so profound you could hear a pin drop. What they didn't know is that Apex Financial is my private holding company. I let the words hang in the air. For 2 years, I have been using my corporate bonuses to secretly pay for the very roof over their heads. I have been paying their property taxes while they treated me like a disappointment. I raised the legal document higher. They stole my wedding fund to pay for this party while I was literally keeping them off the street. Aunt Patricia dropped her martini glass. It shattered against the hardwood floor, but no one even looked her way. The shock in the room was palpable. And as of yesterday afternoon, I declared, my voice echoing like a judge delivering a sentence. The secret grace period is officially over. I have filed the foreclosure paperwork. The bank will be serving eviction notices by Wednesday. You have exactly 30 days to vacate my property. Sienna burst into tears, a loud, ugly wail that pierced the silence. She grabbed Trey's arm, shaking him frantically. But I wasn't finished. I turned my attention to Trey, who was sweating profusely, his arrogant demeanor completely shattered. He looked like a cornered animal. Now, Trey, I said, my tone shifting to one of cold amusement. I carefully considered your generous offer to do your bookkeeping, but as a senior forensic accountant, I have a strict personal policy against working for federal criminals. The executives from Horizon Equity, the venture capital firm Trey had been aggressively courting, suddenly sat up perfectly straight at their premium table. Trey stammered, demanding someone cut the microphone, but the sound engineer was too paralyzed by the drama to move. I pulled the second document from my clutch, the forged warranty deed, and held it out toward Trey so he could see his own sloppy handiwork. In order to secure his massive venture capital funding, I announced to the room. Trey submitted falsified asset declarations. He listed my property, the house owned by my LLC, as his personal collateral. I pointed to the fake digital notary seal. He fabricated revenue streams and forged government documents. I looked directly at the Horizon Equity executives. My firm manages the grant he applied for. I personally handed his forged documents to our compliance department yesterday morning. Trey lunged forward, trying to grab the microphone, but Nolan materialized instantly, stepping smoothly between us. Nolan placed a firm hand on Trey's chest, shoving him back with effortless strength. Nolan didn't say a word. The cold warning in his eyes was enough. Trey stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. I stepped around Nolan, delivering the final devastating blow. Our managing partner has already contacted Horizon Equity, I announced, my voice ringing clear and triumphant. They have pulled his funding, frozen his pending contracts, and blacklisted his name across their entire network. The federal banking regulators have opened an investigation. Trey, you should probably use the rest of Sienna's stolen wedding fund to hire a very good defense attorney. The ballroom descended into absolute chaos. The wealthy investors immediately stood up, grabbing their coats, wanting nothing to do with a federal fraud investigation. Sienna's crying escalated into hysterical screams as she hit Trey's chest. My father stared blankly ahead, completely broken, while my mother sobbed into her hands, her perfect, wealthy life smashed into a million unrecoverable pieces. I lowered the microphone, placed it gently on the podium, and turned my back on them. My work was done. The sharp tap of my fingernail against the microphone echoed through the Oak Ridge Country Club ballroom like a gunshot. 150 pairs of eyes stared at me in stunned silence. Nobody moved. The waiters stood completely frozen, holding their silver trays of champagne. My mother looked as if all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of her lungs. She gripped the edge of the head table so hard her knuckles turned stark white under the crystal chandelier lighting. Trey stood awkwardly a few feet away from me, shifting his weight from side to side, his arrogant smirk completely wiped from his face. I smiled. It was not a warm or forgiving smile. It was the smile of an auditor who had just found the missing millions and was about to lock the vault. I spoke clearly and evenly, ensuring my voice reached every single corner of the massive room. I started by thanking my parents. I told the crowd that Richard and Diane had truly outdone themselves this time. I pointed to the towering swan ice sculptures, the endless flow of expensive vintage champagne, and the 10-piece jazz band sitting silently in the corner. I said it was a breathtaking display of wealth and generosity, especially considering they had just gifted my sister a massive $75,000 check at a steakhouse the night before. A murmur of impressed approval rippled through the audience of wealthy socialites and venture capitalists who were completely unaware of the trap I was springing. My parents forced tight, stiff smiles, trying desperately to maintain their wealthy facade in front of their peers, even as panic flickered in their eyes. Then I dropped the first match into the powder keg. I looked directly at my father and said that their incredible generosity was actually nothing short of a financial miracle. I paused, letting the word miracle hang in the heavy air. I explained that it was a miracle because my parents had not paid their $2 million mortgage in exactly 24 months. The murmured approval in the room instantly vanished. It was replaced by a sharp collective gasp that rippled through the premium tables. My father's face drained of all color, turning an ashen, sickly gray. He tried to stand up to stop me, but his legs seemed to give out, and he sank heavily back into his upholstered chair. My mother opened her mouth to scream at me, but no sound came out. She looked as if she had been physically struck by a freight train. I did not give them a single moment to recover or spin a lie. I reached into my emerald green designer clutch and pulled out the thick stack of legally binding documents. The crisp white paper stood out starkly under the stage spotlight. I held up the first document and announced to the room that 3 years ago, my father nearly bankrupted the family trying to maintain his beautiful illusion of wealth. I explained that when the bank was days away from foreclosing on their sprawling suburban estate, a private holding company called Apex Financial stepped in. I told the crowd that Apex Financial bought my parents' defaulted debt, saving them from the immediate humiliation of eviction and total financial ruin. I took a deliberate step closer to the edge of the stage, my eyes locked directly on my mother. Her chest was heaving, her perfectly contoured face contorted in absolute terror. I told the silent room that my parents believed a generous private equity firm was covering their missed payments. They thought they had outsmarted the banking system and found a magical loophole that allowed them to live rent-free in a mansion while funding destination weddings. What they did not know, I said, my voice dropping into a cold, authoritative register, was that Apex Financial is my private holding company. I let the words echo through the ballroom. I watched the realization hit my parents like a physical blow. For 2 years, I have been using my own corporate bonuses to secretly pay for the very roof over their heads. I spoke with absolute icy precision. I have been paying their exorbitant property taxes, their home insurance, and their massive interest rates while they treated me like a disappointment. I raised the legal document higher so the venture capitalists in the front row could see the official county stamps. They stole my grandfather's trust fund, my designated wedding money, to pay for this extravagant party, while I was literally keeping them off the street. Aunt Patricia, who had been mocking my boring lifestyle just an hour earlier, actually dropped her martini glass. It shattered loudly against the hardwood floor, but not a single person looked her way. The shock in the room was absolute and suffocating. The wealthy socialites my mother spent decades trying to impress were now staring at her with undisguised horror and pity. My father finally found his voice. He stood up, his hands shaking violently, and shouted that I was lying. He pointed a trembling finger at me and told the crowd that I was a jealous, bitter woman making up stories to ruin my sister's special night. He demanded that the country club manager remove me from the stage immediately. I did not flinch. I simply opened the folder and pulled out the undeniable proof. I am a forensic accountant, Richard, I said, using his first name to entirely strip away his paternal authority. I do not make claims without receipts. I read aloud the exact dates and amounts of the last 24 mortgage transfers I had made from my personal bank account to Apex Financial. I read the original foreclosure notice from 3 years ago, and the subsequent deed of trust bearing his exact signature. I then read the formal notice of default I had authorized that very morning. I declared to the room that as of yesterday afternoon, the secret grace period was officially and permanently over. I told my parents that I had filed the accelerated foreclosure paperwork with the county recorder of deeds. The bank will be serving the neon eviction notices directly to your mahogany front door by Wednesday morning. I announced, my voice ringing like a judge delivering a final sentence. You have exactly 30 days to pack your belongings and vacate my property. Sienna burst into tears. It was not her usual manipulative crying designed to get attention. It was a loud, ugly wail of pure, unfiltered panic that pierced the silence of the country club. She grabbed Trey's arm, shaking him frantically, demanding to know what was going on and asking where they were going to live after the wedding. My mother collapsed forward, resting her head on the table and sobbing uncontrollably. The glittering facade of her perfect, wealthy life was completely smashed into a million unrecoverable pieces right in front of the exact people she cared about most. The illusion was dead. The golden child was entirely defunded, and the scapegoat they had spent 35 years underestimating was standing on a stage, holding the deed to their entire existence. The destruction of my parents was absolute, but I was not entirely finished. The ballroom was suffocating under the weight of the massive revelation I had just dropped. My father was paralyzed in his chair, staring into the abyss of his ruined reputation. My mother was slumped over the head table, weeping into her sequined sleeves. But while they were drowning in their own manufactured tragedy, my eyes locked onto the other parasite in the room. Trey was slowly edging his way backward toward the heavy velvet curtains draped behind the stage. He was trying to quietly slip away while the entire room was focused on the spectacular implosion of my parents. He thought he could escape the blast radius. He was completely wrong. I turned my body entirely toward him. The harsh glare of the stage spotlight followed my movement, pinning him against the dark fabric like an insect trapped under a magnifying glass. I did not raise my voice, but I spoke with a sharp, commanding authority that froze him dead in his tracks. I told him to stay exactly where he was. I said that since this entire lavish gala was supposedly celebrating his brilliant future as a tech visionary, it would be incredibly rude for him to leave before the final presentation. Trey swallowed hard. The arrogant swagger he had carried into the coffee shop when he threatened Nolan was entirely gone. His custom-tailored suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for him. He raised his hands in a weak defensive gesture and tried to force a laugh. He grabbed a nearby glass of water and took a shaky sip, trying to project a calm demeanor to the venture capitalists watching his every move. He told me that I had made my point and that I should just step down before I embarrassed myself any further. I smiled at him. It was a terrifying smile. I took 2 slow steps toward him, closing the distance. I looked him dead in the eyes and delivered the line I had been waiting all weekend to say. "And Trey," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the massive sound system, "it was incredibly brave of you to use my property as collateral for your $500,000 startup loan. I believe the FBI calls that wire fraud." The silence that followed was so profound it felt like a vacuum. The executives from the venture capital firms who had been whispering among themselves suddenly went perfectly still. Trey dropped his water glass. It shattered against the polished wooden stage, sending water and crystal shards scattering across the floorboards. He pointed a shaking finger at me and yelled that I was a liar. He shouted to the crowd that I was just a jealous corporate drone trying to sabotage his billion-dollar idea because I could not stand to see my sister marry a highly successful man. He claimed his collateral was rock solid and fully vetted by top-tier legal professionals. I actually laughed, a cold, sharp sound that cut through his desperate lies. I opened my emerald green designer clutch and pulled out the second stack of printed documents. I held up the photocopied warranty deed he had submitted to my corporate grant committee. I told him that his top-tier legal professionals must have been using a pirated version of Photoshop. I turned back to the audience, specifically addressing the tables where the wealthy investors were seated. I walked them through the anatomy of his amateur crime. I explained that in order to secure his initial $500,000 funding, Trey had blatantly falsified his asset declarations. I told the room that he had found a digital image of a notary seal online and pasted it onto a forged property deed, claiming full legal ownership of the $2 million suburban estate that my parents were currently being evicted from. The exact same estate that belonged to my private holding company. I looked down at the Horizon Equity partners sitting at table 3. I named them directly. I said that as seasoned investors, they knew better than anyone that submitting forged real estate collateral across state lines to a federally insured institution carried a mandatory minimum sentence in federal prison. Trey panicked. His survival instincts kicked in, and he made a massive, uncalculated mistake. He lunged toward me. He took 3 rapid steps across the stage, reaching out with both hands to rip the forged documents and the microphone away from me. He wanted to silence me by sheer physical force. He never even made it within arm's reach. Nolan, who had been standing quietly at the base of the stairs, moved with terrifying speed. He vaulted up the steps and inserted himself flawlessly between Trey and me. Nolan did not throw a punch. He simply planted his feet, placed a solid, unyielding hand directly against Trey's chest, and shoved him backward with an incredible surge of power. Trey stumbled wildly, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the spilled water. He crashed hard into the wooden podium, knocking over the heavy floral arrangement. Nolan stood over him, adjusting his suit jacket. He looked down at Trey and calmly reminded him that his legal consulting fee was $1,000 an hour, but this particular lesson in boundaries was completely free. Trey scrambled to his feet, his face flushed with rage and profound humiliation. He looked wildly around the room, searching for a single friendly face. He looked at the investors he had spent months aggressively courting. They were already standing up. The lead partner of Horizon Equity was throwing his napkin onto the table, signaling to his associates that they were leaving immediately. Trey grabbed the edge of the podium and screamed into the ambient air that they could not leave. He shouted that his proprietary software was weeks away from launch, and that they were making a massive financial mistake. I stepped out from behind Nolan and delivered the final, absolute crushing blow. I told Trey that they were not making a mistake. I announced to the entire ballroom that the venture capital firm he was begging to stay had officially pulled out of his deal over an hour ago. I watched the confusion wash over his face as I explained that my corporate restructuring firm was the exact agency that managed the Horizon Equity grant portfolio. I told him that I had personally walked his forged prospectus into the office of our senior managing partner yesterday morning. I explained that we had placed a priority conference call directly to the board of directors at Horizon Equity. I stated clearly and loudly that his accounts were currently frozen, his pending contracts were completely terminated, and his name was officially blacklisted across every major investment network in the city. Complete and utter chaos erupted. The investors did not walk toward the exits, they practically sprinted, wanting absolutely zero association with a man who was actively being investigated for federal wire fraud. Sienna, who had been weeping over her parents' lost mansion, suddenly realized she was shackled to a sinking ship. Her true shallow nature surfaced instantly. She scrambled up the stairs of the stage, her high heels catching on her designer gown. She did not run to comfort her fiancé. She ran straight at him, screaming at the top of her lungs. She slapped him hard across the face, demanding to know if he was actually broke. She shrieked that she was not going to marry a poor criminal and spend her life visiting him in federal prison. She ripped the massive diamond engagement ring off her finger and threw it directly at his chest, where it bounced off and rolled away into the shadows of the stage. My mother suddenly snapped out of her weeping paralysis. Seeing her golden child screaming and her perfect social standing completely obliterated, she directed all her blind fury toward me. She pushed herself up from the head table, knocking over her chair. She screamed my name, her voice cracking with pure hysterical hatred. She lunged toward the stage stairs, desperately trying to grab the microphone from my hand to somehow spin a lie and fix the unfixable. I did not give her the chance. I looked at the absolute destruction surrounding me. The golden child was screaming at her fraudulent ex-fiancé. The arrogant tech bro was completely ruined and staring blankly at the floor. The wealthy parents were facing imminent eviction and total social exile. The lavish engagement gala funded by my stolen money had transformed into a spectacular public funeral for their fake empire. I held the microphone up for one final second, looking directly into my mother's wild, desperate eyes as she reached the bottom step. Then I simply let go. The heavy metal microphone dropped from my hand. It hit the hardwood stage floor with a deafening electronic crack of feedback that echoed violently through the massive country club ballroom. The sharp, piercing sound made several people cover their ears. I did not look back. I turned on my heel, the emerald silk of my gown sweeping across the floorboards. Nolan held out his arm, and I looped mine through his. We walked down the side stairs of the stage, completely ignoring my mother, who was now kneeling on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. We walked straight down the center aisle of the ballroom. The remaining guests parted for us immediately, stepping back in pure, stunned silence. Nobody said a word to us. Nobody tried to stop us. We walked out the heavy mahogany doors of the Oak Ridge Country Club, leaving the screaming, the crying, and the complete destruction entirely behind us. I woke up the next morning to the gentle sound of rain tapping against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my condo. The gray light filtered through the room, casting a soft, peaceful glow over everything. For the first time in 35 years, I did not wake up with a tight knot of anxiety in my chest. There was no impending family crisis to manage, no passive-aggressive text messages to decipher, and no impossible expectations to meet. The heavy, suffocating presence of my family had been completely exorcised from my life. I laid in bed for a long time, just listening to the quiet rhythm of Nolan breathing beside me. When I finally walked into the kitchen, Nolan was already awake, brewing a fresh pot of coffee. He handed me a warm mug and kissed my forehead. He did not ask how I was feeling or if I regretted what happened at the country club the night before. He already knew the answer. I took a sip of my coffee and finally reached for my phone resting on the marble counter. I tapped the screen and watched as a massive wave of notifications flooded the display. There were exactly 67 missed calls. My voicemail inbox was completely full, and my family group chat had over 100 frantic messages. I leaned against the counter and pressed play on the first voicemail. The polished, arrogant voices from the country club were entirely gone, replaced by raw, unfiltered panic. The first message was from my mother, Diane. Her voice was trembling, completely devoid of the country club superiority she had worn like armor her entire life. She was begging. She said, "Gemma, please pick up the phone right now. There are men from the bank outside. They are taping bright green eviction notices to the front door, and the neighbors are watching. Please call the bank and stop this. We can work something out. We are your family. You cannot do this to us." I deleted the message without a second thought. She did not care that we were family when she stole my wedding fund to pay for my sister's vacation. She only remembered the concept of family when she needed a shield to protect her from the consequences of her own actions. The next voicemail was from Sienna. It was a chaotic symphony of hysterical sobbing and shrieking accusations. She screamed into the phone that Trey's bank accounts were completely frozen and that his credit cards were declining. She wailed that her luxury Italian destination wedding venue had just canceled their booking because the massive deposit check bounced. She blamed me for entirely ruining her life, destroying her brand, and embarrassing her in front of her social media followers. Even in the face of federal wire fraud and complete financial ruin, Sienna's only genuine concern was her public image. The final voicemail was from my father, Richard. He sounded small, defeated, and incredibly old. He did not yell or make demands. He quietly asked if we could set up a meeting with my lawyers to discuss a payment plan to keep the house. He still genuinely believed he had negotiating power. He still thought he could charm his way out of a legally binding foreclosure. I listened to their panic and felt absolutely nothing. They were drowning in the exact ocean they had spent years trying to push me into. For my entire life, they had treated my resources, my patience, and my love as an endless well they could draw from without ever giving anything back. They thought I was a permanent fixture in their lives, a safety net that would always catch them regardless of how cruelly they pushed me. I opened the family group chat where they were rapid-firing messages oscillating between vicious insults and pathetic apologies. I did not write a long paragraph explaining my feelings. I did not give them the closure of an emotional argument. I tapped the screen and typed out 3 short sentences. Too late. It is already done. You invested in the golden child, so enjoy your returns. I hit send. Then I opened my phone settings and systematically blocked my mother's number, then my father's, then Sienna's, and finally Trey's. I completely severed their digital access to my life. I erased their ability to reach me to hurt me or to demand anything from me ever again. I set my phone down on the counter, looked at Nolan, and smiled. The war was officially over. 6 months later, the cold Chicago rain was nothing but a distant memory. The gentle hum of the city traffic was replaced by the rhythmic sound of crystal-clear ocean waves crashing against the shore. I stood barefoot on the warm golden sand of a private beach in Maui, the tropical sun warming my skin. The heavy emerald green armor I wore at the country club had been traded for a simple, elegant white silk wedding dress that blew softly in the ocean breeze. Nolan stood at the end of an aisle made of tropical flowers, wearing a light linen suit and smiling at me with tears in his eyes. There were no towering swan ice sculptures. There were no champagne fountains or 150 wealthy strangers judging our worth. Our wedding consisted of exactly 20 people. Nolan's kind and supportive family, my closest friends from college, and the few colleagues at my firm who truly knew and respected me. It was small, intimate, and absolutely perfect. Every single detail of this beautiful trip, from the private beachfront ceremony to the exclusive penthouse honeymoon suite we were returning to that night, had been paid for in cash. When the bank finalized the foreclosure on my parents' suburban estate, the property went straight to public auction. Because it was located in a highly desirable neighborhood, it sold in less than a week for well over the remaining mortgage balance. As the legal owner of Apex Financial, the massive profit from the sale went directly into my accounts. My parents' desperate attempt to maintain a fake wealthy lifestyle had ironically funded the most authentic and beautiful day of my life. My parents were forced to downsize into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city, completely exiled from their wealthy social circles. Sienna was living with them, her social media influencer career dead in the water after her followers discovered she was engaged to a fraud. And Trey was currently navigating the federal justice system, facing multiple counts of wire fraud and forgery, with no venture capital money to save him. They were exactly where they deserved to be. The string quartet began playing a soft acoustic melody. I took a deep breath of the salty ocean air and took my first step down the aisle. I did not have a father to give me away, because I did not belong to anyone but myself. I walked down that aisle on my own 2 feet, moving toward the man who had stood by me when the entire world told me I was worthless. I looked at the people gathered around us, smiling with genuine joy. I looked at the vast, endless blue ocean stretching out to the horizon. And as I placed my hand in Nolan's, I realized the greatest victory was not exposing my family at a country club or taking their house. The ultimate revenge was simply living a beautiful, peaceful life, completely untouched by their toxicity. I had finally broken the chains they wrapped around me, and for the first time in 35 years, I was completely, absolutely free. Looking back on the wreckage of that night, the greatest lesson I learned was not about financial strategy or legal leverage. It was about the dangerous illusion of toxic family loyalty. For years, I believed that if I just worked hard enough, if I sacrificed enough, and if I silently paid their debts, my family would eventually see my worth. I treated my own boundaries as negotiable simply because we shared the same blood. But blood does not entitle anyone to exploit your kindness or disrespect your life. I learned that you cannot buy the genuine love of people who are fundamentally committed to misunderstanding you. My parents and my sister built an entire identity around superficial appearances and treating me as a convenient stepping stone. When I finally stopped laying down so they could walk all over me, their entire world collapsed. The destruction of their fake empire was not a tragedy, it was a long overdue correction. The most empowering realization was that stepping away from a toxic environment does not make you the villain. It makes you the architect of your own peace. I lost a family that never truly wanted me, but I gained absolute freedom, profound self-respect, and a future built on a foundation of genuine love with Nolan. I learned to stop setting myself on fire just to keep other people warm. Your value is never defined by the people who cannot afford to appreciate you. You have the absolute right to walk away, to close the checkbook, and to let them face the severe consequences of their own choices. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your own peace and future? I would love to read your stories of resilience in the comments below. Please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with anyone who needs the courage to finally choose themselves today.